I want to talk about the religious freedom angle of this debate, which I think is going to come to a head pretty soon because of developments taking place now in Detroit, Michigan, concerning a Muslim group that practices both male and female genital cutting. And so there's a sort of collision course that's been brewing for easily over a decade, and I think that collision course is essentially here. So I thought maybe we should get ahead of that and talk about the different ways this might play out once the crash occurs.
Keep at the forefront of our minds that genitals come in different shapes and sizes, and there is not a sort of clear and obvious binary that people tend to refer to in the popular discourse, and that's going to become very important in the sort of next stages of this debate as well. So let me just sort of show you what we have here. On the left side, you have stereotypically male genitals, penises and penis-like structures. Over on the right side, you have stereotypically female genitals, and then you have these sort of gradient cases in the middle. A certain proportion of babies are born each year with so-called intersex conditions or atypical genitalia with respect to these stereotypes. And all of these kinds of genitals can be modified for what are sometimes called medically unnecessary reasons. And I'll just sort of walk through some of these different ways in which genitals of all types are sometimes modified in this way. On the left-hand side, you have male genital cutting occurs in two major world religions, Judaism and Islam, as well as in the United States as a sort of cultural practice, as we know. It also takes place throughout the African continent and parts of the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And over here on the right-hand side, we have also some overlap with some Muslim groups, but not others, that practice both male and female genital cutting. And that's the case that I'm going to be spending the most time sort of talking about today. In the group in question, the Dawoodi Bohra, they refer to both male and female circumcision with the same word, khatna. The form of cutting they do on their girls is less invasive than what they do to their boys, but both are motivated by religious motivations and supported by similar scriptural passages, which I'll get more specific about in a little bit. You also find female genital cutting throughout the African continent, also in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And in this context, it's not all cases, but a very typical scenario is that these sorts of genital cutting practices occur in parallels, a rite of passage or initiation into adulthood. And I've been surprised recently to find that one difference between them is that on balance it seems that the male genital cutting rituals tend to be more deadly than the female ones. And I want to pause on this for a moment just because with respect to the legal situation, it's often presumed that female genital cutting is categorically more harmful than male genital cutting. And this is often raised as a reason why it's appropriate that the law should treat these forms of cutting differently. Someone might be able to correct me if I'm wrong. I've been digging into this for a while, and I can't get very clear statistics on what exactly the mortality rate is for female genital cutting as a rite of passage in this African context. There's a recent, fairly thorough review published here in Population that I thought was a rich and fair assessment of the available literature. And I found down in a footnote on page 262 that infant and childhood mortality linked to FGM is poorly measured and is invisible in mortality statistics for the affected countries. So there's clearly a measurement problem here. It's certainly not the case that no one is dying, but we don't know how many are and in virtue of which kinds of procedures. The data for the male case, I'm just picking one chart that's available from one province in one country. This is South Africa and refers to the COSA initiation rite. And these are the figures just on a 6-month by 6-month basis. So if you look over on the right-hand side, you see deaths, 23, 13, 14, 20, 21, 17. In the middle column, you have mutilations, and by this, this refers to very extreme mangling and disfigurement of the penis so that it's essentially non-functional. They don't count, but the loss of foreskin obviously is a mutilation in this chart. So this is just something to keep in mind about the sort of wide range of practices that occur along that spectrum I held at the beginning, and this is complicating the legal situation in a Western context, which presumes a very clear dichotomy between these forms of cutting. Another difference is that female genital cutting is not common in Judaism. There may be some exceptions among some Ethiopian Jews as it happens, but generally speaking, not associated with Judaism. Also not a common practice in the United States, unless you want to refer to what's sometimes called cosmetic female genital surgeries. And there's been a burst of research recently suggesting that what's characterized as cosmetic cutting is done increasingly to younger and younger girls in the United States and England and other such cases. And so the line here between supposedly adult consensual cosmetic enhancement and sort of culturally informed cutting of younger and younger girls, the sort of Western, non-Western dichotomy is also breaking down. And then the other big difference is this one, is the legal difference. Cutting on the male end of the spectrum is legal everywhere, mostly unregulated. You don't need to have a medical license to perform male genital cutting if it's characterized as a circumcision. I had read that in South Africa there was some restriction, that in fact under the age of 16 circumcision was prohibited for boys, but I was in South Africa recently and I did some digging around and some asking around. And as it turns out, there's an exception for religious practice and also an exception for so-called health reasons. In other words, anyone who wants to perform a circumcision on an underage boy can appeal to one of these two reasons. So in essence, there's, although there's in name some sort of restriction, there isn't in practice. Over on the right-hand side, when you look at the female end of the spectrum, all such forms of cutting, so long as they're done for what are called non-medical reasons, which is a very complicated kind of messy phrase. These are criminal offenses, sometimes carrying life sentences, as in the case that I'll discuss shortly. The United States, UK are characteristic in this regard, but the United Nations has sort of asked that all member states officially ban female genital cutting of any kind, sometimes even when it's done by the request of an adult woman, and that's true in UK and in Australia, which is sort of troubling. It equates the consent capacity of adult women with girls. Sort of paternalistic. In the middle here we have intersex cases, and this is very confusing currently because some forms of intersex genital cutting just are FGM on the available definition from the World Health Organization. So if you have a healthy child with a larger than average clitoris but no functional difficulties, and this clitoris is essentially shaved down or cut down through clitoroplasty, when this is not done to restore or preserve any kind of function, that just is a form of female genital mutilation, but it's not treated as such legally. That's becoming more and more controversial. So because of very good scholarship and people drawing lines between the male side of the spectrum and the middle of the spectrum and the female side of the spectrum, intersex cases are becoming more controversial, and I think that that's appropriate. Now, of course, there aren't just sort of 6 stages of intersex cases. This is really more of a spectrum, and what I've been trying to highlight in recent work is this question here. At what point does a small penis, which is legal to cut in just about every Western regime, become a large clitoris, which is illegal to cut? And the answer is that there's no strict location where that is. It's just an arbitrary cutoff. And so I think this is going to pose serious problems for the law being able to defend a sex-based distinction in which sorts of interventions are allowed and which are not. So I'm just going to suggest in this talk that sex-based legal distinctions are heading for a collision course with defenders of male and female genital cutting now sort of regrouping and appealing to religious freedom as a way, a sort of last stand against some of these other arguments that are beginning to break down. Now, this notion of a collision course goes back at least to Dina Davis back from 2001, and this paper is not cited enough. It's a really thorough, carefully argued, sort of disturbing paper that I'm surprised is not read more. Dina Davis pointed out that federal and state laws that criminalize genital alteration on female minors are so broad in their language that they cover even procedures that are significantly less substantial than newborn male circumcision. And she says that a complete laissez-faire attitude toward one practice coupled with total criminalization of the other runs afoul of the free exercise of religion clause of the First Amendment. And there are also troubling implications, she writes, for constitutional requirement of equal protection because the laws appear to protect little girls but not little boys from religious and culturally motivated surgery. So she illustrates this with a series of matched cases which I think are evocative enough that I just want to walk you through them because they really make the point very well. She says, let's suppose we match up a deeply religious Muslim couple who wish to have their daughter genitally altered and who believe it is a religious obligation, and who are willing to accept a relatively minor procedure, with a deeply religious Jewish couple, on the other hand, who wish to have their son genitally altered because they believe it is a religious obligation. It's hard to justify why the first couple's wish is illegal and the second's is not. She says, if we imagine that the Muslim girl's experience will be a tiny nick with proper pain control in a hospital context, while the Jewish boy's experience will be a somewhat larger operation by a non-medical practitioner without adequate pain control, or in some cases any pain control, the justification becomes even more difficult. All right, let's look at our second case now. We have a Jewish couple who are planning a surgical operation without the attendant ritual by a physician who's not a moil. Nonetheless, if questioned about their decision, they insist that it's part of being Jewish and that leaving their boy unaltered is unthinkable. They don't know if they will ever join a synagogue or educate the boy religiously or have him bar mitzvah, but they do know that leaving him uncut will make him look odd to his Jewish friends, may have a negative effect on his ability to marry a Jewish girl, and will bring down the wrath of their parents. Okay, match that couple with a couple from sub-Saharan Africa who are vague about their religious beliefs, but have a general feeling that to leave their little daughter uncut is somehow non-Islamic, just as it would be for their son. Further, they have good reason to fear that their daughter, if left uncircumcised, will be laughed at, perhaps ostracized, and have a very difficult time marrying within their culture. Again, what is the justification for respecting the first couple's mix of beliefs and custom, but not the second? Well, these cases were set up as sort of hypothetical comparisons, but there's now a case, as I alluded to before, that's essentially testing exactly this comparison, and this is now coming up before the legal scene in the United States concerning this woman here and some others who are members of the Dawudi Bohra sect, a Shia sect of Muslims who are based primarily in India and Pakistan, but have immigrated to other parts of the world, including Detroit. This is the first federal FGM case in the US. The form of cutting, the alleged crime, occurred in a clinical setting by a doctor. The Bohra practiced what they call khatna on both boys and girls for religious reasons, appealing to similar scripture in support of that. And the typical male operation, as I'll demonstrate in a moment, is far more invasive than the typical female operation in this group, but only the female operation is regarded as criminal in the United States. So this is one of the first available, somewhat comprehensive surveys of the practice in the Dawudi Bohra community. And I just want to say a little bit about its origin. The authors of this report, who did a survey of some 300 to 400 women, consist of a social worker, a researcher, 2 filmmakers, and a journalist who had all been speaking out in their own ways against the practice of khatna. As their collaboration grew, they realized the need for an organized, informed forum with the community that could help drive a movement to bring an end to khatna. So these are reformers from within the community, sort of bravely sticking their necks out and saying, we'd like to see this practice come to an end. It's also relevant, though, because when you look at this research and the sort of way they describe the practice, because these are individuals who'd like to see the practice end, they would have a motivation to sort of potentially oversell and exaggerate the harms. But they don't do that. They're very cautious and conservative in saying what they find. And here's what they state. In most instances, the process involves the removal of a pinch of skin from the clitoral hood at the age of 7, or between the ages of 6 and 12. And then with respect to religious significance, while the Quran, Islam's holy book, does not sanction FGC, the Daim al-Islam, a religious text followed by this community, does endorse the practice. So they don't sort of hedge and say, oh, it's not really religious, as the kind of narrative quickly goes. They say, no, it's a religious practice within this group. Nevertheless, we'd like to see it stop. So here's just a graph of their findings. Interestingly, 65% of the women who were surveyed didn't know what type of FGC had been performed. But among those who were confident in their view, the vast majority of them stated that it was part of the clitoral hood that had been removed in their group. Now, just a note about this sample, these 309 who were surveyed were essentially recruited through a snowball sampling method, which means friends of friends of friends of friends sort of invited each other. So the initial group of researchers asked 10 people that they knew well, and then said if you could get 10 more people from each of you, and then they kind of go out that way. So again, these are folks who are willing to speak about the practice at all, which in this particular community is highly stigmatized and looked down upon. And so that needs to be kept in mind when interpreting these results. It's not a representative sample. So I just want to ask what the legal implications are about what we've been discussing so far with respect to this issue of religious freedom. And to do that, I just want to go back a few years to a precedent case carried out in England. This is the matter of B and G. And what's interesting about this case is it covers facts that are almost exactly identical to the ones that are now being addressed in Detroit, the first U.S. federal case. So it will be very interesting to see how the U.S. federal prosecutors and the defense attorneys negotiate the legal questions in light of an earlier case that covered similar facts. So this is Sir James Munby, a senior British judge. in Leeds, sitting on the family court. And this was the question facing the judge. Was a girl subjected to type 4 FGM? And this is that hodgepodge category with nicking and pricking and scraping and so forth. And this is the way that the judge reasoned. He said, well, the family are Muslims, so the girl's FGM type 4 hadn't been proved, and in the end they weren't able to find any evidence that indeed she had been subjected to any form of genital cutting, so the case was dismissed on those grounds. But he reasoned nevertheless, had that been proved, it would have been relied upon by the local authority as justifying the adoption of both her and her brother, B, even though on any objective view it might be thought that G would have been subjected to a process much less invasive, no more traumatic, if indeed as traumatic, and with no greater long-term consequences, whether physical, emotional, or psychological, than the process to which B has been or will be subjected. So here's the problem that was identified by the judge. He says circumcision of the male is the removal of some or all of the prepuce, foreskin, the retractable fold of skin that surrounds and covers the glands of the penis so as to expose the glands. Circumcision involves the removal of a significant amount of tissue, dozens of square centimeters of very sensitive tissue, creates an obvious alteration to the appearance of the genitals and leaves a more or less prominent scar around the circumference of the penis. It can readily be seen that although FGM of WHO types 1, 2, and 3 are all very much more invasive than male circumcision, he has a sort of caveat about one form of type 1, which is sort of the form I've been talking about, which is modification of the clitoral hood. But nevertheless, he says, at least some forms of type 4, for example, pricking, piercing, and incising, are in any view much less invasive than male circumcision. Well, given the comparison between what's involved in male circumcision and FGM WHO type 4, to dispute that the more invasive procedure, and here he's referring to male circumcision, involves the significant harm involved in the less invasive procedure, namely the female genital cutting, would seem almost irrational. So, in my judgment, if FGM type 4 amounts to significant harm, as in my judgment it does, then the same must be so of male circumcision. Now, this was a significant moment in British law because it's the first time male circumcision has ever been described as a significant harm. But the judge was clearly very uncomfortable at having followed the train of his own reasoning because he reached a conclusion that's sort of unsayable and that's certainly inconsistent with the predominant narrative in Western discourse generally. And so you could tell that he sort of wanted to rescue the distinction and see if he could get himself somewhat back toward the regular way of speaking about things whereby male and female genital cutting are treated in these hermetically sealed separate discourses. So here's how he tried to rescue the distinction. He says, well, FGM has no medical justification and confers no health benefits. Male circumcision is seen by some, although opinions are divided, as providing hygienic or prophylactic benefits. And then he makes the kind of classic move to the culture versus religious distinction. He says, well, FGM has no basis in any religion, which just as a sentence, that's a very poorly researched sentence. That's just not true. On any reasonable conception about what it would mean for a practice to have a basis in religion. So this is the power of dominant narratives to shape the thinking of even clearly very thoughtful judges who are interested in the nuance. He says, male circumcision is often performed for religious reasons. I just want to flag this at the beginning. Male circumcision is, of course, also performed for what you might call merely cultural reasons. That's predominantly how it's done in the United States, and also among sort of non-practicing Jews and Muslims who do it for merely cultural reasons. In those cases, it's equally tolerated. So it's not the case that people say, well, okay, for those for whom it's a very important religious practice, that's okay, but all these sort of merely cultural male circumcisions, we should stop doing those. So this sort of appeal to a distinction between the two, it seems a little bit disingenuous to me because it clearly isn't a motivating factor when evaluating the male case. Now, with Michael Thompson and Jennifer Hendry, I have a sort of journal article that came out with just point by point going through the Munby decision. I won't go through all the details, and if you want to look at this, Georgianne mentioned academia.edu. All my papers are free there, and you can kind of read it at your leisure. But the main points I try to make is that with respect to health benefits, the apparent distinction whereby male circumcision has been associated with at least some health benefits and female genital cutting has no health benefits, it cannot validly be used to justify differential treatment by the law because it's largely a consequence of the current legal situation whereby they're treated fundamentally differently. So let me explain. If you remove any tissue from the body, it won't become infected, and it's plausible that removing tissue from many different parts of the body would confer some health benefit in the sense that the incidence of some problem affecting that part of the body might be reduced. I seem to have muted myself. There we go. So consider the case of neonatal labiaplasty. Now, you can't perform neonatal labiaplasty. You certainly can't conduct a study or a randomized control trial to see if any health benefits might follow from neonatal labiaplasty, but they very well might. It's not implausible to think that, for example, cancers of the labia would be reduced if you reduce the surface area of the labia. So just on anatomical grounds, this is a perfectly plausible hypothesis. But it's right that it's illegal to find this out because it would be immoral to remove the labia of young girls to sort of investigate or query whether there might be some health benefits that would follow from that. But in cultures where FGC is common, the medical establishment routinely associates health benefits with the cutting. So Stephen here and Rob Darby, who I finally got to meet in Australia a couple months ago, and that was really fun to get to meet Rob after all these years, writing papers with him long distance. They've pointed out that you can find appeals to a lower risk of vaginal cancer, less nervous anxiety, fewer infections from microbes gathering under the hood of the clitoris, and protection against herpes and genital ulcers. I've done it again. There we are. With respect to the Dawoodi Bohra in particular, Tasneem Raja, who's a member of the community and a former editor at NPR, says that, well, some Bohra women believe that female circumcision has something to do with removing bad germs and liken it to male circumcision, which is widely believed within this group to have hygienic benefits. Now, none of this is to say that female genital cutting has net health benefits. I don't think that's the case, but nor do I think that's the case about male genital cutting. So whenever you hear the claim that FGM has no health benefits, and this has become kind of a mantra for the World Health Organization, if you follow them on Twitter, for example, they have a new article every day saying FGM has no health benefits, only causes harm. And it all sounded strange to my ears. I thought, why are they harping on about no health benefits? And I realized why, and I'll explain why in a moment. But what you should read that as saying is we don't actually know if certain minor sterilized forms of FGM have health benefits because it's unethical and would be illegal to find out if that were true. And here's what I realized was bothering me. The mantra is really disingenuous. And the reason why I say that is because if there were health benefits, if somebody came along and had some convincing evidence that female genital cutting of one kind or another prior to an age of consent conferred some kind of health benefits, I really don't think it's the case that anti-FGM campaigners would suddenly say it's permissible. They go, oh, well, I guess if there's health benefits, it's okay then. That's certainly not the case. They would say, rightly, it's wrong to do this because it damages healthy genital tissue and violates the bodily integrity of the girl without her consent. And that's true regardless of whether health benefits might or might not follow. That's clearly how the response would go. And so I think all this dwelling on the issue of no health benefits is a bit of a red herring. But more than that, I think there's a risk of repeating this mantra in every context. And that's that if defenders of female genital cutting come to think that health benefits make the cutting seem okay to Westerners, they will conduct the necessary research to find them. And as I've suggested, it's not implausible that they would. This is especially true when you think of the sort of broad way that health gets interpreted, including actually the World Health Organization's definition of health, which is sort of like total bodily and spiritual well-being rather than some sort of narrow physical notion. So if you look at the literature now on cosmetic labiaplasty in Western medical journals, you find abundant claims of health benefits in terms of mental health. So they'll say, well, obviously, if a woman feels enhanced cosmetically, this will have many beneficial consequences for her mental well-being. And this actually falls well within the World Health Organization definition of health. And so you could just do citations right now and build a case of health benefits for FGC as long as you want to construe health widely. And as I say, even if you construe it narrowly, it may very well be that there are health benefits there too. So I've written this piece here, which I guess is sort of unfortunately titled because I got some very angry responses on Twitter from people who clearly had not read anything in the article, but thought that I was somehow proposing that female genital mutilation had health benefits, when the second part of the sentence, which says the problem with medicalizing morality, was trying to suggest that that should sound like a very silly question. It should sound like a wrong question. Why are you even asking if it has health benefits? It's like a category error. That's not the concern. So in this, I raise a couple of points. I first draw attention to Fwamba Amadou's work, where she has shared the view of one woman in her research who says, why would any reasonable mother want to burden her daughter with excess clitoral and labial tissue that's unhygienic, unsightly, and interferes with sexual penetration, especially if the same mother would choose circumcision to ensure healthy and aesthetically appealing genitalia for her son? Similarly, as I go on to say in the article, the women in societies that practice what they call female circumcision are just as devoted to their cultural traditions as are the men who practice genital cutting of boys. They don't want their customs banned either. And of course, I'm referring to those who hold that view, not to reformers, and the homogenizing tendency in a lot of this discourse is problematic. But for those who support female genital cutting, it's no less important to them than those who support male genital cutting. If medical benefits are sufficient to ward off condemnation, what you're doing is creating a strong incentive to seek them out. And I just think that that's a risk that we should be very mindful of. Okay, well, hasn't male circumcision been associated with a whole bunch of health benefits? In this crowd, I don't need to go through all this, and so that's a whole separate talk that I won't give. The main points that are familiar to all of you is that most of the evidence that's worth even giving serious consideration to concern adult circumcisions, which nobody here objects to on ethical grounds, although I will say that there's rather coercive campaigning going on where a lot of men are not getting to make this decision under genuine conditions of informed consent. There's a lot of body shaming going on as part of the official campaign, and so forth. So I'm very concerned about that. But let's just say in principle, if an adult man were making an informed decision, I don't think anyone would object to that. The key issue also, if all you care about is the medical benefit question, is net benefit, not some benefit. Like I said, there's probably some health benefit from removing most parts of the body, but that has to be weighed against the disadvantages of doing that, which are not only physical, but also psychological and sexual and moral. So, as we know, the American Academy of Pediatrics is the only relevant organization that claims that there are indeed net medical benefits for newborn circumcision. The CDC released a draft policy that wasn't peer-reviewed and has never been finalized, and I sort of don't get the impression that it will be. If anyone has any information about what the fate is of the CDC draft, I'd like to hear it. European, British, Australasian, Canadian medical associations disagree with the AAP. They either say that the benefits do not outweigh the risks outweigh the benefits, they're closely balanced, we don't know. Canada actually has moved a step further. The Canadian Urological Association has now come out with a further sort of policy after the Canadian Pediatric Society one, which is more carefully researched and reaches a similar conclusion that the benefits don't outweigh the risks. And as we know, at least some of these European colleagues have suggested that the AAP might be culturally biased. So this is the sort of famous article that we throw around a lot. There's all these big wigs that say the AAP might be culturally biased, and so their main conclusion was this. To these authors, only one of the arguments put forward by the AAP has some theoretical relevance to infant male circumcision, namely the possible protection against urinary tract infections in infant boys. The other claimed health benefits are questionable, weak, and so forth, and do not represent compelling reasons for surgery before boys are old enough to decide for themselves. Now, when we cite this, some of those who are in favor of male circumcision will point out that, well, the AAP responded and you never mentioned their response. So I'm just going to mention their response and show why it's not very convincing. So here's what the AAP said in response. They said, all of the commentary authors, they miss Noni MacDonald, who's from Canada, but they hail from Europe, where the vast majority of men are uncircumcised and the cultural norm clearly favors the uncircumcised penis. In contrast, approximately half of US males are circumcised and half are not. Therefore, the cultural bias in the United States is much more likely to be a neutral one than that found in Europe, where there's a clear bias against circumcision. So they first made a bit of an error. The accusation was that the people on the panel actually making the decision were culturally biased, not that generally in the United States some sort of 50-50 representation would lead to a neutral view. But I just want to dwell on this for a second. I don't think it's right to say that the cultural norm in Europe favors the uncircumcised penis as a specific thing. It favors also uncircumcised female genitalia, and it favors non-surgically altered body parts generally. So I think it's just a bit weird to sort of treat this as though it's a distinct category, the lack of which is a norm in Europe. So here was my response to the AAP reply, and it bothered me for so long that I decided to write a paper with David Shaw where I just kind of went through their reasoning piece by piece. Well, piss is right too. So here's just a few highlights of what David and I argue. So we say, well, let's just simply grant that there is indeed this cultural norm in Europe that clearly favors the intact penis, notwithstanding that we shouldn't grant it. But even if we do for the sake of argument, it doesn't follow from this, as the AAP Taskforce implies, or rather states, that its European counterparts are biased against circumcised penises. The reason for this is that whatever the wider cultural norm concerning circumcision happens to be in Europe, there's also a relevant medical norm, not only in Europe, but also in the United States, which holds that Medically unnecessary surgeries should generally not be performed on healthy children, and surgery should almost always be a last resort rather than a first resort for managing or preventing disease. So it's not just a matter of two local arbitrary cultural norms being pitted against one another. Rather, the shared norms governing responsible medical practice in Western countries are typically biased against such non-therapeutic procedures. So by suggesting that a cultural norm that favors the non-therapeutic surgical modification of a child's penis is somehow on par with, or just as reasonable as, a medical ethical norm favoring the avoidance of such surgery unless it's absolutely required, the AAP task force just shows its cultural hand. Okay, so what about this culture versus religion distinction that the British judge appealed to sort of rescue the distinction between male and female forms of genital cutting? Well, it's often said that there's no mention of FGC in the Quran. There's also no mention of MGC in the Quran. And this is taken as evidence that the practice is not religious. And this is just a bad argument, and I'm really surprised to see it trotted out all the time. Just as in Judaism and Christianity, perceived binding religious obligations can arise from oral teachings and extra-biblical sources, so rabbinic teachings or papal encyclicals, Islam too looks to other sources to interpret and supplement Quranic teachings, such as the Hadith, the prophetic sayings of Muhammad. So as we saw before, this comes from the reformers within the Dawoodi Bohra, sort of acknowledging that the Da'im al-Islam, which is one of these hadith, is a religious text that is perceived as creating this binding obligation within that community, and it endorses the practice. So making a more general point, Alex Meyer says, in Sunni Islam, the dominant branch, 2 of the 4 schools of jurisprudence consider type 1 female circumcision to be obligatory. This is sort of modification of the clitoral prepuce. While the other 2 schools recommend the practice, and the scriptural support for this is no weaker than that for male circumcision within Islam. So both are derived from the secondary source of Islamic law, and neither is to be found in the Quran. So if we defer to religious justifications, we'll find that in many cases, the circumcision of female as well as male children could be permitted on that basis. Now, some might take this to be a reductio ad absurdum of the argument from religion, but others might very well bite the bullet. Well, with Ari and Shabisi, we have a chapter that we have coming out where we sort of explore this issue a bit further, so I'll walk you through some of our points. We say, well, this creates a dilemma. If male circumcision should be permitted generally and for any reason, because in some groups it is regarded as an explicitly religious practice, then relatively more mild forms of FGC that are regarded by some groups as a religiously required practice should be given equal consideration and should also be tolerated for all groups regardless of the reason. Just by parity of reasoning, that should be the case. Indeed, some prominent defenders of ritual male circumcision, aware of the existing double standard, have recently begun to argue that mild forms of female genital cutting should in fact be tolerated in Western law, presumably to ensure that the legal status of male circumcision remains unquestioned. Now, alternatively, one might argue that male circumcision should only be permitted when it's done for explicitly religious reasons, which would exclude most US American circumcisions, and might also exclude sort of non-religious Jewish and Islamic circumcisions that would otherwise done for cultural reasons. I realize that the religion-cultural divide in these cases is not so simple, but that's sort of my point generally. In which case, by analogy, only groups that regard FGC as religiously required would be permitted to perform the cutting, and all others would be disallowed. Finally, one could argue that neither male nor female non-therapeutic childhood genital cutting should be permitted regardless of the religious motives of the parents. And you kind of have to make one of these moves. There aren't so many other gestures in logical space you can make. So we write, whatever option one favors, the common emphasis in this discourse on religion versus culture is telling. The apparent assumption is that religious norms are categorically different from and more important than merely cultural norms. But it's not obvious that there is a firm line, whether in practice or conceptually, between what is religious and what is cultural, nor is it obvious that one should be elevated above the other as a legitimate grounds for cutting the genitals of a child. Now, whose religion are we talking about anyway? A common point in this group is that the religion and culture of the parents is not always shared by children as they grow up. Many people sort of move away from the religious and cultural affiliations with which they were raised. Some recent research from Pew suggests that, well, in the US public, in general, people are becoming less religious. The nation's youngest adults are, by many measures, much less religious than everybody else. And so this just creates a sort of empirical concern, that is, if you as a parent presume that your child will grow up to share your religious commitments such that they will appreciate a permanent marking on their body reflecting this religious affiliation, this is just a contestable thing that seems less and less likely to be true. More generally, I've been describing this as a problem of instability, and the instability I mean is this. The sorts of factors that shape people's attitudes and preferences about genital cutting are not stable in multicultural societies where people have ready access to other points of view through the internet or whatever. And there's room also for considerable individual variation even within a given cultural or religious group. And the implication of this is that if you change your religious or cultural affiliation because you either move to another place and are exposed to new ideas or you just gain a different perspective, your frame of reference for interpreting your own genital modification may change. And what this means is that some people who grew up in a relatively closed community whereby they were told that their genital modification was normal or even an enhancement or an improvement, and may very well have believed that for much of their lives, at some point they come to gain a different perspective and recast what had happened to them as being rather a diminishment or even a mutilation. This comes out nicely, depressingly, in this exploratory survey that I mentioned earlier, and I'll just share one of these stories with you. As the years rolled by, I attained puberty, and after experiencing my first menstruation, I became aware of my sexuality. At this point of time, my second eldest sister, in order to give me an understanding of sexual knowledge, gave me a book to read, Encyclopedia of Sexual Knowledge, authored by Dr. Van de Velde. After reading that book, the full impact and realization of that awful, painful, and life-changing procedure, which I was made to undergo at the innocent age of 7 years, dawned on me. I was privately distraught and enraged to learn that I had been robbed of my basic feminine rights to sensuality and sexuality. This feeling disturbs and traumatizes me even today. I feel robbed and cheated of my sexuality, and feelings of inadequacy and incompleteness remain with me till today, even at the age of 61. The emotions of impotent rage and anger refused to leave my mind or my spirit. After making a private self-examination, I found that the prepuce, or the entire foreskin of my clitoris, had been cut off. I've given short shrift to intersex cases primarily because there are others in the room who are more expert in this than I am and will be talking about it later, but let me tell a story. I had never heard about this growing up. No one had ever talked about this, so that summer I went back home and talked to my mom about it. She remembered that the doctors had suggested a surgery in order to fix what they called a disorder, and she thought it was just a correction for something that might have gone a little bit wrong. However, nothing was wrong with me. I have a natural variation of sex. They just used that language in order to fit me into an imagined sex binary, thinking that it would be better for me. But it actually has created a lot of harm for me and for many other people. Finally, a story told to Ron Goldman. The shock and surprise of my life came when I was in junior high school and I was in the showers after gym. I wondered what was wrong with those penises that looked different than mine. I soon realized I had a part of me removed. I felt incomplete and very frustrated when I realized that I could never be like I was when I was born, intact. This frustration is with me to this day. Throughout life, I have regretted my circumcision. Daily, I wish I were whole. I just want to highlight that there's no mention of complications here. The person isn't saying, well, I had a botched circumcision, or I had some severe laceration or something like that. Rather, it seems to be the case that simply just having had tissue removed without consent is sufficient in this case to cause these disturbed feelings. So in all of these cases, what you have is a sort of change of mind or perspective. The person went through much of their life sort of feeling like this is just the way things were, and then they gain a different perspective. Their genitals are still the same, but all of a sudden their attitudes regarding what happened to them change, and this can have profound implications for how they view themselves and how they navigate through the world and engage in their sexual relationships and so on. I mean, there are dozens of other examples in the testimonial literature for male and female and intersex cases I could have drawn from, but this is a very common theme. It's not so much the case that you have to have a sort of medical or surgical error. It's the sheer involuntary loss of healthy tissue, the loss of genital intactness that's often felt as a harm. So how should we think about these cases? My colleagues and I have been writing about the sort of interesting technology. It's a brain stimulation device that people are now thinking they might use on their children to supposedly increase their numerical capacity by stimulating a certain part of the brain. They've also thought about using this to affect memory. And this is an interesting example that will help support the point I want to make, because you can enhance long-term memory or short-term memory, but you sort of can't do both. They're wired up in the brain in such a way that you have a trade-off. So if you try to improve long-term memory by doing this brain stimulation, you might impair short-term memory and vice versa. And so we were asking, is it permissible for parents to try to improve their children's memory in some way, given that it is going to come at a certain cost, or at least is likely that that's true? How should we evaluate this ethically? And here's what we came up with. We said, well, adults are in a position to decide whether effect X is valuable enough to them to justify incurring loss Y. But children do not yet have the capacity or the life experience to make such trade-off decisions. They don't know what they will value when they grow up, nor do their parents. So while an intervention that improves X may count as an enhancement for the individual who does not care much about Y, another individual, valuing Y over X, will view the very same outcome as an impairment. So in these sorts of cases, that is, cases in which the very status of an intervention as being an overall enhancement versus an impairment is controversial, and that certainly applies to all the cases of genital cutting that we're discussing, the weight of consideration should shift toward delaying the intervention until the individual who will be affected by it can make a decision under conditions of informed consent. And the more permanent and substantial the trade-off, the more this argument has force. So the implication of that is that non-therapeutic genital cutting should not be performed on children. The option should be left to the individual when they're an adult so they can make an informed decision. And this brings together these different genital cutting practices all along that spectrum that I opened with under one ethical paradigm that's focused on children's rights to bodily integrity and sexual autonomy. And I think what's nice about this paradigm is that this is the case regardless of race, religion, culture, sex, or gender. So you eliminate in one fell swoop these double standards that are often racialized in a really unappealing way and often have these sort of gender differences as well that I don't think can be justified. Here it becomes more about children's capacity and consent. Now, I've had some discussions with people who primarily advocate against female genital cutting, and they've said, listen, I see your point that there's a lot of overlap between male and female and intersex, and I sort of concede some of these empirical observations you've made. But nevertheless, let's just keep these campaigns separate. I'm going to focus on anti-FGM stuff, you folks can do anti-circumcision stuff, and let's each leave well enough alone. And I don't think this is a very promising strategy, and that's what I'm going to sort of conclude with, is to argue that keeping these things completely separate is just not a good idea for anyone, including those who, as it were, only care about eliminating female genital cutting. So Dina Davis points out one of the problems with this. She says, as long as the US continues to countenance MGC, the criminalization of even the ritual nick cannot fail to dilute the persuasiveness of the official stance against FGC while carrying the unmistakable taint of intolerance and double standards. This is something that's come to light, which is that those individuals who are strongly committed to perpetuating what they call female circumcision are not stupid. They see the double standards, and some of them, including members of the Dawoodi Bohra and others who are highly educated, many of them scholars, are calling bullshit and pushing back. And so I just want to call your attention to this difficult and disturbing website about female circumcision. And this has been put up by supporters of female circumcision. And what's really troubling about this is that there's far more nuance and scholarly depth in this website than the World Health Organization policy, which is replete with these kind of rhetorical maneuvers to try to pull the wool over your eyes and pretend that male and female genital cutting are completely different. The point that FGC supporters are now making is that if you support male circumcision and you're intellectually honest and you don't want to just be bigoted against my group, then by rights you have to tolerate female circumcision as well. And the problem is that their argument's pretty good. And this is why I think you can't treat these issues separately. And let me just get into one example of this. So let's go down to the consent and parental rights argument for female circumcision. This is a quote from the website. Minors, by definition, are incapable of making decisions for themselves. Therefore, consent on behalf of minors is routinely provided by parents, where parents determine what is in the best interest of the child. And this sounds exactly like the playbook for supporters of male circumcision, doesn't it? This right is not limited by notions of bodily integrity and medical benefit alone. Rather, in securing the best interest of a child, parents rightly consider social, cultural, religious, and familial benefits and harms, in addition to medical benefits and harms when making decisions. Now you see they have a hyperlink here, if you're wondering what that links to. It's the AAP Taskforce report on circumcision, and they're quoting from the support that the AAP gives for male circumcision, and says, listen, if that's your view, if it's not just about medical benefits and risks, but these social and cultural and other things, well, gee, female circumcision has those things too, so you should give us equal consideration. So they say male circumcision is by far the most prevalent procedure on male infants, and despite attempts to ascribe significant health benefit to it, it remains primarily a religious rite. The procedure is not without risk, but since it is deemed culturally and legally acceptable, it is often overseen by medical professionals and performed in sanitary and controlled environments. Male circumcision is an excellent example of a religious procedure of contested health benefit that is nevertheless legally protected and made largely safe due to medicalization and regulation. Clearly, mere risk of potential harm is not sufficient to override parental consent and authority. However, parental authority for consent can be nullified in cases of serious harm, but mere bodily integrity is clearly not sufficiently compelling interest to override parental authority, for if it were, male circumcision wouldn't be tolerated. So they conclude, it's our assertion that female circumcision, if performed correctly under medical supervision, causes no harm. And I've heard that from defenders of male circumcision as well. I mean, we just had with the illustration of the 61-year-old woman that harm, of course, is the sort of thing that can come about not simply through having had a surgical complication, but the very lifelong harm can come about through psychological mechanisms when you reflect on what's happened to your body without your consent. So the no harm argument here is just not convincing. They say, well, female circumcision is a practice that was briefly endorsed by the American Academy of Pediatrics, and many of us know that history, and still is promoted as an ethical alternative to unsupervised and unregulated genital cutting that's deemed to cross the medically safe line. As has been noted elsewhere on this site, female circumcision is anatomically similar to male circumcision. It's a nick, or a small removal of a portion of the clitoral hood, which is an analogous structure in females as the foreskin in males. Now you might think, okay, well, here's some obscure website set up by proponents of a surgery, but why should we care about those arguments? Let's just keep doing our separate campaigns. Well, I don't think that's any longer a viable response because it's starting to be picked up by not so obscure outlets such as the Journal of Medical Ethics here. Kavita Shah Arora and Ellen Jacobs, who primarily were known for defending ritual male circumcision, noticed the double standards, and they realized that they were going to be backed into a corner if they tried to suggest that all forms of female genital cutting should be prohibited. And I have to give them credit for intellectual consistency here, because in order to deal with that, they wrote a paper suggesting that, well, so-called minor forms of female circumcision should indeed be tolerated. And that was the logical conclusion of their support for male circumcision. And this was published in the leading healthcare ethics journal in the world. Okay, so it's confined to academics, no big deal. Well, The Economist came out with an editorial just last year, I believe, basically endorsing the arguments of Arora and Jacobs, saying after 30 years of attempts to eradicate a barbaric practice, it continues, it's time to try a new approach, and the new approach is tolerance for female circumcision. So these and other mainstream sources now explicitly rely on the presumed moral and legal acceptability of non-therapeutic religious male circumcision to justify arguments in favor of female circumcision. And this is a growing trend. I think it's worth pushing back against, and I think the way to do that is to have a coherent and conjoined effort on the part of advocates for children's rights to emphasize that it's the lack of consent that's the main ethical issue. This is something that, of course, applies equally across sexes and genders when you're dealing with a small child. Now, the response to this that opponents will make is they'll say, well, listen, young children can't consent to anything, and there are all sorts of things that parents can authorize for their children, so merely appealing to a lack of consent is not sufficient. And indeed, it is not. But I think it needs to be bolstered by pointing out that the genitals are not like other parts of the body. And the sorts of risks to which you might be exposed by playing sports, as is often raised as a comparable case. I mean, I don't need to go through the bad analogies because everyone here has heard them 100 times. But I think it needs to be clear that it is the lack of consent that's the main issue, and that the genitals are special. And everybody knows that. And when they start talking about ear piercing and football, it's dishonest. That's clearly not the same sort of thing. Now, these points hold true regardless of net health consequences, positive or negative, and they hold regardless of parental motivation. And I think this is important because this sort of argument is going to be impervious to empirical refutation. This is what I was talking about the no health benefits for FGM thing. Don't hold your argument hostage to that, because if somebody goes along and comes up with some health benefits, you have to concede your case. And why would you want to leave yourself exposed to that kind of argument? Even if there were health benefits, you should be on strong moral footing to say that that's actually not sufficient to make the practice permissible. And so we can move away from this sort of distraction about whether there are health benefits or not. And then also this issue of the, parents or communities' inner motivations, this unmeasurable thing about what is the real reason why they're doing these procedures. Well, it's really different in the case of boys and girls. I mean, when you look at the full range of practices in different societies, you just see far too much overlap for that to be true on the sort of system level. But also, you can't get inside any individual parent's head and assess the true reason for why they're doing it. Any reason that they give you is going to be sufficient as long as they say the right one. So, again, don't hold your argument hostage to what the real motives are, because if somebody comes along and says, well, in this culture, that's not the motive, to control female sexuality, let's say, then you have to say, oh, well, I guess in that culture it's okay. I don't think that's what people want to say. So don't leave yourself hostage to those kinds of developments in literature. So I think that this is the strongest argument for anti-FGC, anti-MGC, and anti-IGC campaigns across the board, is the consent and the specialness of the genitals issue. And I don't want to pour salt in anyone's wounds here, but I think that this implies that we're stronger together and should proceed as a sort of unified front focusing on children's rights. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.